I know this is going to sound completely insane, but I spent 5 months living in a hidden settlement deep in the Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri. 5 full months. I'm a field biologist with over 12 years of experience in wilderness research. And what I'm about to tell you is the absolute truth. I have no proof because they destroyed all my equipment on the first night, smashed it to pieces right in front of me. But I need to tell someone what I saw. I've kept this secret since early 2021, and it's been eating me alive from the inside. The weight of this knowledge is too much to carry alone anymore. I'm not looking for attention or fame. I just need someone to know that these beings exist, that I lived among them, and that they're far more complex and intelligent than anyone could imagine. It was late October when I drove my beat-up Jeep down a narrow Forest Service road into one of the most remote sections of the Ozarks. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Track mountain lion movement patterns and study deer migration corridors for the Missouri Department of Conservation. I'd done this kind of fieldwork dozens of times before. Solo expeditions didn't scare me. I actually preferred the solitude, the rhythm of wilderness routine, the clarity that comes from weeks away from civilization. The trailhead parking area was nothing more than a gravel clearing surrounded by dense hardwood forest. I loaded my backpack with 2 weeks' worth of supplies, checked my GPS coordinates one final time, and started hiking. The plan was simple: establish a base camp near a known deer corridor, set up trail cameras, collect scat samples, and document any signs of predator activity. Standard research protocol. But I remember feeling something strange even on that first day. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no squirrel chatter, just the sound of my boots crunching through fallen leaves. I told myself it was nothing, just the seasonal transition between autumn and winter. Animals get quieter as the cold sets in. That's what I believed then. I hiked for nearly 6 hours before finding a suitable campsite near a spring-fed creek. The water was crystal clear, the ground relatively flat, and there was good visibility in all directions. I set up my tent, arranged my equipment, and prepared my first meal as the sun dipped below the ridge. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through bare branches, completely unaware that something was already watching me, something that had been tracking my movements since I crossed into their territory. I didn't know it yet, but my life as I knew it was already over. The first sign came the next morning. I woke up just after dawn and unzipped my tent to find the world covered in a thin layer of frost. My breath hung in the cold air as I stepped outside and stretched, planning my route for the day. That's when I noticed the trees. About 30 yards from my camp, 3 young saplings had been bent over and woven together at chest height, forming a perfect triangular arch. The branches were fresh, still green underneath the bark where they'd been twisted. I stood there staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Wind doesn't create geometric patterns. Animals don't weave branches together with that kind of precision. I walked over and examined the structure more closely. The bark showed clear manipulation marks, but they weren't from tools. They looked more like something had gripped and twisted the wood with immense force, bending it without breaking the inner fibers. I took photos from multiple angles, documenting everything. At the time, I thought maybe I'd stumbled onto some forgotten trail marker or a hunting blind from years past. But something about it felt wrong. The placement was too deliberate, too visible from my campsite. It was positioned exactly where I would see it, first thing in the morning. That afternoon, I found the bones. I was following a game trail along the ridge when I came across a flat rock outcropping. Arranged on top of the stone were the skeletal remains of at least 4 different animals: a deer skull, 2 raccoon jawbones, what looked like a turkey's breastbone, and several smaller bones I couldn't immediately identify. They weren't scattered randomly. They were arranged in a circular pattern, with the deer skull positioned in the center, facing directly back toward my camp. My hands were shaking slightly as I photographed the display. This wasn't predator behavior. This wasn't natural scavenging or territorial marking. This was intentional arrangement, communication, a message. I had no idea what it meant, but I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't alone out here. And whatever was sharing this forest with me wanted me to know it. Over the next 3 days, the signs became impossible to ignore. Every morning, I would wake up to find something new, something that shouldn't have been there. Small cairns of stacked stones appeared along the trails I used most frequently. More bent trees, always in groups of 3 or 4, always forming those same geometric patterns. And then there were the symbols. I first noticed them carved into the bark of an old oak tree about a quarter mile from my camp. They weren't letters or any recognizable language, just simple shapes. Circles within circles, parallel lines, triangular formations. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and damp. I ran my fingers over the grooves, feeling how deep they went. Whatever made these marks had serious strength. That night, something happened that I still can't fully explain. I was lying in my sleeping bag, reading field notes by headlamp, when I heard it. A rhythmic tapping sound echoing across the valley. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, 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 tap. It came from somewhere on the opposite ridge, maybe half a mile away. The pattern repeated every 30 seconds or so, like someone testing the acoustics of the forest, measuring distances through sound. I killed my headlamp and listened in complete darkness. The tapping continued for nearly 20 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant. I barely slept that night, lying there with my hand on the bear spray attached to my belt, listening to every crack and rustle outside my tent. When morning finally came, I found my backpack moved. I know exactly where I'd left it the night before. Hanging from a bear line I'd rigged between 2 trees, about 8 feet off the ground. But now it was sitting neatly on the ground beneath a small shelter made of carefully arranged branches. The shelter hadn't been there when I went to sleep. Someone, or something, had constructed it during the night, directly over my pack, like they were protecting it from rain that never came. There were no animal tracks around the area. No paw prints, no claw marks, nothing. But the grass was flattened in a broad pathway leading away from the shelter, crushed down in a way that suggested something large and bipedal had walked through. The stride length was enormous, easily 6 or 7 feet between impressions. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and hike back to civilization. But I'm a scientist, and scientists don't run from unexplained phenomena. We document them. We gather evidence. We find rational explanations. What an idiot I was. I had no idea what was actually happening, no concept of what I'd walked into. I thought I was observing some kind of territorial behavior, maybe from a black bear exhibiting unusual intelligence. The possibility that something else might be out there never seriously crossed my mind. Not until I saw it standing on the ridge. It was the 5th morning. Heavy fog had rolled into the valley overnight, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards. I was boiling water for coffee when I happened to glance up toward the eastern ridgeline. There, silhouetted against the gray morning sky, stood a figure. It was massive. Even from that distance, I could tell it was at least 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms. It stood completely still, facing directly toward my camp. Not hiding, not moving, just watching. The posture was unmistakably human-like, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too wide, too solid. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 or 20 seconds. Me frozen beside my camp stove, it motionless on the ridge. Then, without any sudden movement or sign of alarm, it simply turned and walked away. Not hurried, not frightened. Just turned and disappeared into the fog, like it had decided the observation was complete. My coffee water boiled over, hissing against the flames. I didn't even notice. I spent the rest of that morning in a state I can only describe as controlled panic. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I packed my essential gear, ready to evacuate at a moment's notice. But I didn't leave. Something kept me there, some mixture of scientific curiosity and pure, stubborn disbelief. I needed to know what I'd seen. I needed proof. By midday, the fog had burned off completely, leaving the forest sharp and clear under a pale November sun. I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to follow it. Whatever that thing was on the ridge, it had left tracks, and I was going to find them. I grabbed my camera, a notebook, my GPS unit, and headed toward the ridgeline. The climb took about 40 minutes through dense undergrowth and over loose shale. When I finally reached the spot where I'd seen the figure standing, I found exactly what I was looking for. The footprint was massive.
It was pressed deep into a patch of soft mud near a seasonal drainage, perfectly preserved. The shape was unmistakably humanoid: 5 toes, a distinct heel, an arch. But the proportions were wrong in ways that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. The print measured just over 17 inches long and nearly 8 inches across at the widest point. For comparison, my own boot print beside it looked like a child's shoe. I photographed it from every angle, placed my field ruler beside it for scale, measured the depth of the impression. The weight required to sink that deep into the mud would have been enormous, easily 400 pounds, maybe more. I found 3 more prints leading away from the ridge, each one showing the same impossible dimensions. Then the trail just stopped. Not gradually, not obscured by harder ground. It simply ended at a rocky outcropping, as if whatever made those prints had either taken flight or deliberately chosen terrain that wouldn't hold impressions. I spent 2 hours searching the surrounding area and found nothing. No broken branches, no disturbed leaves, no indication of which direction it had gone. That's when I started to understand something important. This wasn't just an animal moving through the forest. This was intelligence, planning, evasion. I was being led somewhere. Looking back now, I realized the tracks were placed deliberately, spaced just right to keep me interested, to keep me moving deeper into territory I didn't understand. But I didn't see it then. I thought I was hunting. I didn't realize I was being evaluated. I followed the ridgeline east for another mile, checking every game trail and depression for more signs. The afternoon light was starting to fade when I noticed my compass acting strangely. The needle was spinning slowly, refusing to settle on magnetic north. I tapped the casing, thinking maybe moisture had gotten inside, but the behavior continued. Then my GPS lost signal entirely. I stopped walking and checked the device. No satellite lock. I was standing on an exposed ridge with clear sky overhead, and somehow my military-grade GPS couldn't find a single satellite. The screen showed my last known position from 15 minutes earlier, but the current location field was just blank. A cold feeling settled into my chest. Something was very wrong with this area. I looked around, really looked, and noticed for the first time that the forest here was different. The trees were older, more twisted, their bark covered in strange patterns of moss that seemed almost deliberately arranged. The underbrush was thicker, forming natural barriers that channeled movement in specific directions. And there, barely visible through a tangle of wild grapevines, was an opening between two massive limestone formations. A passage. A doorway. I know I should have turned back right then. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to retrace my steps, to get back to familiar ground while I still could. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was on the other side. I pushed through the vines and entered the narrow corridor. The stone walls rose 15 feet on either side, slick with moisture and covered in that same unusual moss. The passage twisted twice before opening up, and when I stepped through to the other side, I forgot how to breathe. I was standing at the edge of a hidden basin, a natural amphitheater completely enclosed by steep cliffs and dense forest. It was maybe 200 yards across, with a small stream running through the center. And scattered throughout the basin were structures, not natural formations, not animal dens, structures. I counted 12 structures in total, arranged in a loose semicircle around the stream. They were dome-shaped shelters, maybe 8 feet tall at the center, constructed from woven saplings, vines, and packed clay. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Each dome had a low entrance covered with what looked like woven bark panels, and smoke holes at the top, sealed with flat stones that could be adjusted. This wasn't primitive. This was engineered. Near the stream, I could see a series of stone-lined fire pits, each one surrounded by flat rocks arranged like seating areas. Drying racks made from stripped branches held what appeared to be fish and strips of meat, protected from scavengers by intricate, cage-like covers. There were work areas with tools laid out in organized rows: stone scrapers, bone awls, wooden mallets, carefully shaped rocks that could only be hammers and grinders. And everywhere, there were signs of ongoing habitation. Fresh ash in the fire pits, recently turned earth in what looked like a root storage area. Clay pots sitting near the stream, still damp. This place was active, lived in, maintained. I stood at the edge of the basin, my camera hanging forgotten around my neck, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. There were no uncontacted human tribes in Missouri, no lost civilizations hiding in the Ozarks. And yet here was a village, a functional settlement, existing in complete secrecy just a few miles from Forest Service roads. That's when I realized how quiet it had become. No birds, no insects. Even the stream seemed to have stopped its burbling. The entire basin had gone silent, like the forest was holding its breath. I wasn't alone anymore. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw them emerging from the structures and the tree line. 5 of them at first, then 6. They moved with surprising silence for creatures so large, forming a loose circle around me. None of them showed aggression, but the message was clear. I was surrounded, contained. They were even more massive up close. The smallest stood at least 7.5 feet tall, the largest closer to 9. Their bodies were covered in dark hair, reddish-brown in the fading light, thicker across the shoulders and arms. The faces were flatter than an ape's, more human in structure, with deep-set eyes that reflected the late afternoon sun with an amber glow. Those eyes showed something I wasn't prepared for: intelligence, calculation, awareness. One of them, broader than the others, with a distinctive gray patch across its right shoulder, stepped forward. The movement was controlled, deliberate. It made a low, rumbling sound in its chest, not quite a growl, more like a voiced vibration.
The others responded with similar sounds, a pattern of low-frequency vocalizations that felt more like communication than animal noise. Then Gray Shoulder reached out one massive hand toward my camera. I understood immediately what was happening, but I couldn't make myself comply. That camera contained all my evidence, all my documentation of the past week. Without it, no one would believe what I'd found. I took a step backward, clutching the camera against my chest. The reaction was instant. All 6 of them moved forward simultaneously, closing the circle. Not threatening, not violent, but absolutely certain. There would be no negotiation. Gray Shoulder made that same rumbling sound again, and this time I heard something almost like patience in it. Like a parent dealing with a stubborn child who didn't understand the rules yet. I let go of the camera. Gray Shoulder took it carefully, examined it for a moment with those disturbingly intelligent eyes, then smashed it against a rock with casual efficiency. The sound of shattering plastic and glass echoed across the basin. Next came my GPS unit, pulled from my belt. Destroyed. My satellite phone from my jacket pocket. Crushed. Even my backup phone, hidden in my backpack's inner compartment. They knew exactly where to look, systematically removing every piece of communication technology I'd brought. The whole process took maybe 3 minutes. When it was finished, I stood there surrounded by the wreckage of my professional equipment, completely cut off from the outside world. No way to call for help. No way to document what was happening. No proof that any of this was real. One of the smaller ones, with noticeably longer arms and a lighter coloring, made a gesture toward one of the dome structures. The meaning was unmistakable. Inside, now. I walked toward the shelter, my legs feeling disconnected from my body. The entrance was low, forcing me to crouch. Inside, the structure was surprisingly spacious, the woven walls strong and weather-tight. Bedding made from dried grasses and animal hides covered the floor. A small fire pit sat in the center, cold now, with a smoke hole directly above. They didn't follow me inside, but I could see shadows moving outside the entrance. Guards, watchers. I was a prisoner in a hidden village that shouldn't exist. The first week was the longest of my life. I was never physically harmed, never threatened with violence, but I was under constant observation. Every time I stepped outside the shelter, at least 2 of them were nearby, watching with those unnerving amber eyes. They didn't prevent me from moving around the settlement, but they made it clear through positioning and low vocalizations that certain areas were off-limits. I tried to count days by scratching marks into the dirt floor of my shelter, but time started to blur almost immediately. The rhythm of the settlement was different from anything I'd known. They were most active during twilight hours, dawn and dusk, moving through the basin with practiced efficiency. During the brightest part of the day, most of them rested inside their structures or in shaded areas near the cliffs. I learned to recognize individuals by their physical characteristics and behaviors. Gray Shoulder was clearly the leader, the one the others deferred to with subtle gestures and space-giving.
There was a female, smaller than the males, but still towering over me, with distinctive lighter coloring around her face. She watched me more than the others, her expression difficult to read, but not hostile. I started thinking of her as Luna, though I had no idea if they even had individual names. Then there was the elder, ancient by any measure, with silver-streaked hair across his back and shoulders, moving slowly, but with obvious respect from the group. His eyes were clouded with age, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made me think he'd seen humans before, that he understood exactly what I was and what risk I represented.
The settlement operated with remarkable organization. Each individual seemed to have specific responsibilities. Some maintained the fire pits and structures. Others worked on tool creation and repair. I watched them process animal hides with stone scrapers, their movements precise and practiced. They collected water from the stream in those clay pots I'd noticed, vessels they'd clearly made themselves with considerable skill. But it was their communication that fascinated me most. They used vocalizations, yes, those low, rumbling sounds that seemed to carry meaning through tone and pattern. But more than that, they communicated through gestures. Complex hand movements, body positioning, facial expressions subtle enough that I almost missed them at first. This wasn't simple ape signing. This was language. I started trying to learn it, watching carefully during their interactions, attempting to decode the patterns. When Luna brought me food, usually nuts, roots, and occasionally fish, I began trying simple gestures in return. Thank you. I copied a gesture I'd seen others use, a slight bow with hands pressed together. She stopped, stared at me for a long moment, then made a sound I hadn't heard before. Something almost like surprise, or maybe amusement. She repeated my gesture back to me, then added something else, a subtle shift in hand position that changed the meaning somehow. That was the beginning, the first real communication. Over the following days, I learned more, not enough to hold conversations, but enough to understand basic concepts: food, water, sleep, danger. That last one they taught me deliberately, making the gesture while pointing toward the passage I'd entered through. The message was clear. Out there was danger. For them, and now for me, too. I started to understand why they'd destroyed my equipment, why they kept me contained. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. I represented the outside world, the human civilization that would destroy this place if it knew the settlement existed. They couldn't let me leave, couldn't risk me revealing their location. But they also weren't going to kill me. That would have been easier, cleaner, safer for them. The fact that I was still alive meant something. I just didn't know what yet. 3 weeks in, maybe 4, the routine changed. Luna approached my shelter one evening and made a gesture I'd seen before, but didn't fully understand. Follow, watch, learn. She led me to one of the work areas where several of them were processing plant materials, stripping bark from specific trees, pounding roots into pulp. Medicine, I realized. They were making some kind of medicinal preparation. They let me watch the entire process, Luna occasionally glancing at me to ensure I was paying attention. When they finished, she made another gesture. This one I understood perfectly. You. Help. Soon. Something was coming. Some situation where my presence, my human knowledge, might be useful to them. They were preparing me, teaching me their ways, building trust. But what could a field biologist possibly offer to beings who'd survived in complete secrecy for who knows how long? I didn't have to wait long to find out. 2 days later, the old one collapsed near the fire pit, his arm badly burned from hot coals. The smell of seared flesh filled the basin, and his low moans of pain were unlike anything I'd heard from them before. The others gathered around him, clearly distressed, but uncertain what to do. Gray Shoulder turned and looked directly at me. Then he made a gesture I'd learned early on. Help. Now. I ran to the elder without thinking, my wilderness medical training overriding every other consideration. The burn covered most of his right forearm, the skin already blistering and peeling away. 2nd degree at minimum, possibly worse in some areas. In the wilderness, without proper medical supplies,
Burns like this could easily become infected and turn fatal. The group parted as I approached, giving me space but watching intently. Gray Shoulder made a low sound that seemed to communicate both urgency and warning. I understood. Help him, but don't hurt him. My life likely depended on the outcome. I gestured frantically toward the stream, miming the act of pouring water. Luna understood immediately and brought one of the clay pots filled with cold water. I carefully poured it over the wound, watching the elder's face for reaction. He grimaced but didn't pull away, his clouded eyes fixed on mine with an expression I couldn't quite read. Trust, maybe, or just desperate hope. The first priority was cooling the burn and preventing further damage. I kept pouring fresh, cold water over the injury, speaking softly, even though I knew he couldn't understand my words. The tone mattered, the calm steadiness. I'd learned that much from them. Next, I needed something clean to cover the wound. I tore strips from my own shirt, the cleanest fabric available, and soaked them in the cold stream water. As I worked, I remembered the medicinal preparations I'd watched them make days earlier. Some of those plants had antiseptic properties. I'd recognized jewelweed and what looked like wild plantain. I made gestures to Luna, trying to communicate what I needed. Plant. Medicine. The one with small leaves. She stared at me for a moment, then moved quickly to one of the storage areas, returning with several bundles of dried plants. I sorted through them, found the plantain, and began crushing the leaves between rocks, adding a small amount of water to create a paste. The others watched in complete silence as I applied the poultice to the elder's arm, then wrapped it carefully with the cloth strips. It wasn't hospital-quality care, but it was the best I could do under the circumstances. The elder would need the dressing changed regularly, the wound kept clean, and monitored for infection. I sat back, exhausted, my hands shaking from adrenaline. Gray Shoulder approached slowly and did something I hadn't expected. He reached out one massive hand and gently touched my shoulder, making a low rumbling sound that carried through his chest. The gesture was unmistakable. Gratitude. Respect. Everything changed after that moment. I wasn't a prisoner anymore. Not really. I was something else. A trusted outsider, maybe. A guest with specialized knowledge. They began including me in daily activities, showing me their techniques for food preparation, shelter maintenance, tool creation. Luna took particular interest in teaching me their communication system, spending hours each day helping me learn new gestures and vocalizations. The elder's wound healed slowly but steadily. I changed his dressing twice daily, monitoring for any signs of infection. Each time, he would look at me with those clouded eyes and make a specific gesture. One I eventually understood meant something like healer or medicine person. A title, recognition of a role. About a week after the incident, Luna woke me in the middle of the night. The settlement was active despite the darkness, individuals moving with obvious purpose toward the far end of the basin. She gestured for me to follow, her movements urgent. We walked to an area I'd never been allowed to approach before, a section of the cliff face where natural crystal formations jutted from the rock. The others were already there, arranged in a specific pattern. Gray Shoulder held a piece of polished stone, angling it to catch the moonlight. What happened next, I still struggle to explain rationally. The reflected light hit the crystals, which amplified and redirected it in multiple directions. Other members of the group held additional polished stones, creating a network of light signals that bounced between the crystals and across the basin. The patterns weren't random, they were deliberate, rhythmic, coded. And from somewhere far in the distance, beyond the cliffs, I saw answering flashes. They were communicating. Using reflected light to send messages across vast distances, probably to other groups in different locations. This wasn't primitive behavior. This was sophisticated, planned, evidence of a cultural network far more complex than I'd imagined. Luna noticed me watching and made a gesture I'd never seen before. Secret, important, trust you. I nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what I was witnessing. They were showing me something precious, something that revealed just how organized and widespread their presence might be. This wasn't just one isolated group. This was a society, and I was being allowed to see it. But that privilege came with a terrible burden I didn't yet understand. Because 3 days later, everything would fall apart, and I would have to make an impossible choice. It started with the birds. One morning, the entire basin erupted with alarm calls, crows and jays screaming warnings from the surrounding trees. The group reacted instantly, abandoning their morning routines and moving toward the cliff edges, scanning the forest beyond with obvious agitation.
I'd never seen them this disturbed, not even when I'd first stumbled into their settlement. Gray Shoulder made a series of sharp gestures to the others, and they dispersed quickly to different positions around the basin perimeter. Luna stayed near me, her body tense, her eyes fixed on the eastern passage. She made a gesture I'd learned meant danger, then added another that roughly translated to metal birds or flying things. I didn't understand it first. Then I heard it, a faint mechanical whirring carried on the wind. Drones. My stomach dropped. Someone was conducting aerial surveys in this area, probably geological assessment or forestry management. Standard practice in national forest land, completely routine, and absolutely catastrophic for the settlement. The drones were still distant, but they were getting closer. I could hear the distinct buzzing of multiple units, probably running a grid pattern. Modern survey drones carried high-resolution cameras, thermal imaging, sometimes even ground-penetrating radar. If they passed over this basin, they would capture everything. The structures, the fire pits, the evidence of habitation. Within hours, this place would be swarming with researchers, government officials, media. The group understood this on some instinctual level. They'd remained hidden for generations, maybe centuries, by avoiding exactly this kind of detection. And now their secrecy hung by a thread. Gray Shoulder returned from the perimeter and convened what I can only describe as a council. The elder was there, despite his injury, along with Luna and 3 others I recognized as senior members. They communicated in rapid gestures and vocalizations, a debate I could only partially follow. But the conclusion was clear enough. They were leaving, abandoning the settlement, immediately. I watched in stunned silence as they began a coordinated evacuation. They moved with practiced efficiency, like they'd planned for this scenario. The younger ones dismantled the most obvious structures, scattering materials to look more natural. Others gathered essential tools and supplies, packing them into woven carriers. They emptied the clay pots, kicked dirt over the fire pits, dragged branches across the work areas. Within an hour, the settlement was transforming before my eyes. What had been an obvious village was becoming just another section of forest floor. Not perfect, not if someone looked closely, but enough to potentially avoid detection from aerial survey. Luna approached me carrying a small bundle wrapped in bark cloth. She pressed it into my hands, then made a complex series of gestures. The message took me a moment to decode. Keep. Remember. Tell no one. Then Gray Shoulder was there, his presence commanding attention. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Conflict.
uncertainty. He gestured to the elder, who stepped forward despite his age and injury. What happened next, I didn't expect. The elder reached into a pouch at his side and withdrew something. A braided cord made from plant fibers and what looked like strands of hair, with small carved bone beads woven through it. He placed it carefully around my neck, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle. Then he made a gesture that combined several meanings: gift, memory, bond. Luna touched my arm and made another series of gestures. This sequence I understood perfectly, and it broke something inside me. You go. We go. Different paths. You choose. They were giving me a choice. They could take me with them, deeper into the wilderness, to wherever they planned to relocate. A life permanently separated from human civilization, living as they did, in hiding and secrecy. Or I could leave now, return to my world, carry this secret alone forever. Gray Shoulder pointed toward the passage I'd originally entered through, then made a gesture that meant safe and another that meant time limited. They would escort me out, give me a head start to get clear of the area before the drones arrived. But I had to decide immediately. I looked around the basin one last time. At Luna, who'd taught me their language with patient persistence. At the elder, whose life I'd saved, and who'd accepted me despite every reason not to. At Gray Shoulder, who'd made the impossible decision to trust a human. At the others, who'd allowed me to witness their hidden world. Part of me wanted to stay, wanted to disappear into the forest with them, to learn everything about their culture, their history, their impossible existence. To be the only human who truly understood. But I knew what that would cost. My family would never know what happened to me. Search parties would comb these mountains for months, and eventually the investigation might lead others to discover what I'd found anyway. I touched the braided cord around my neck and made the gesture for gratitude. Then I pointed toward the passage. I was going home, and I would keep their secret. Luna's expression shifted into something I'd learned to recognize as sadness. She made one final gesture, this one unmistakable in any language. Goodbye, friend. Gray Shoulder and one of the younger males escorted me through the passage just after dawn. They moved quickly but carefully, checking the route ahead, listening for any signs of the drones or human activity. I followed in silence, my mind still reeling from the decision I'd made, wondering if I'd just walked away from the most important discovery in anthropological history, or if I'd done the only ethical thing possible. We traveled for hours through terrain that seemed deliberately confusing. They led me through dense thickets, across streams where we walked in the water to avoid leaving tracks, over rocky ground that held no footprints. Several times Gray Shoulder stopped and backtracked, creating false trails that led nowhere. They were erasing my path, making sure no one could follow my route back to the basin. I understood what they were doing, and it hurt. They were protecting themselves from me, even now, even after everything. And they were right to do it. Around midday, we stopped near a small spring. The younger one brought water in his cupped hands, offering it to me with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous with his massive size. I drank, nodded my thanks, and we continued. The landscape gradually became more familiar. I started recognizing landmarks from my original hike, a distinctive rock formation, a dead tree split by lightning, a bend in a creek I'd crossed weeks ago. We were getting close to the boundary of their territory, approaching the zone where I might encounter other humans. That's when Gray Shoulder stopped. He turned to face me fully and made a series of gestures I'd learned to understand. Warning. Humans. Tell truth, they hurt us. Tell lies, you safe. He was coaching me on what to say when I was found, and the message was clear. Any version of the truth would lead people back to them. I had to lie. I had to make up a story that explained my weeks of absence without revealing what I'd discovered.
I nodded, made the gesture for understanding, for promise. He studied my face for a long moment, those amber eyes searching for something. Trustworthiness, maybe. Or just hope that I wouldn't betray them. Then he did something that still haunts me. He reached out and placed one massive hand on top of my head, gentle as a benediction, and made a low, rumbling sound in his chest. Not a vocalization I'd heard before, something older, deeper. It felt like a blessing, or a goodbye that meant forever. The younger one handed me something, my own backpack, empty now except for my sleeping bag and a few basic supplies. They'd kept it all this time, and now they were returning it to make my story more believable. A lost hiker who'd survived in the wilderness would have his gear. Gray Shoulder gestured one more time. Go now. Don't return. Forget. But we both knew I would never forget. They melted back into the forest without another sound, disappearing so completely it was like they'd never been there at all. I stood alone on the trail, my hand touching the braided cord hidden beneath my shirt, and felt the full weight of isolation settle over me. I walked for 3 more days, moving slowly, rationing my energy. I had no food except what I could forage, no map, no working GPS. But I knew the general direction, downhill, following water, heading toward lower elevations, where I'd eventually hit a road or a trail. On the 2nd day, I passed through an area where I could hear distant mechanical sounds, the drones still running their survey patterns. I wondered if they'd found the basin, if their cameras had captured anything suspicious, or if the group's hasty concealment had been enough. I would never know, and I could never ask. On the 3rd day, exhausted and stumbling, I reached a gravel forest road. I followed it for maybe 2 miles before a pickup truck appeared around the bend. An older man, local by the look of him, probably a hunter or fisherman. He pulled over immediately when he saw me, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Jesus, son, you all right? You look half dead." I must have looked worse than I thought. I hadn't seen my reflection in weeks, but I could feel how much weight I'd lost, how worn down I was. Got turned around, I managed, my voice rough from disuse. Lost my equipment, had to survive on what I could find. "What day is it?" "It's December 18th, he said, and my stomach lurched. I'd been gone for almost 7 weeks, far longer than I'd realized. He drove me to the nearest ranger station, where I gave my carefully constructed story. I'd gotten disoriented early in my research trip, lost my GPS and phone in a fall, spent weeks trying to navigate back to civilization. I'd survived on creek water, foraged plants, and one lucky deer I'd managed to trap. It was plausible enough for someone with wilderness training. They were skeptical at first, asked the same questions multiple times in different ways. But my story never changed, and eventually they accepted it. Search and Rescue had been looking for me for 3 weeks before calling it off. My emergency contact, my sister, had been notified I was likely deceased. The guilt of that, of what I'd put my family through, was crushing. They kept me in a hospital for 4 days running tests, checking for parasites, treating dehydration and malnutrition. The doctors were amazed I'd survived as long as I had with minimal supplies. They called it remarkable resilience, credited my wilderness training and physical conditioning. If only they knew the real reason I'd stayed healthy, the food Luna had brought me, the shelter that had protected me, the community that had kept me alive. My sister flew in from Colorado. When she walked into my hospital room, she just stood there staring at me for a long moment before breaking down completely. I held her while she cried, apologizing over and over for the worry I'd caused. She kept saying she'd thought I was dead, that she'd started planning a memorial service. The guilt was overwhelming. but telling her the truth would have been worse. The Missouri Department of Conservation put me on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. Standard procedure for an incident like this. They wanted to understand what had gone wrong, how an experienced field biologist had gotten so disoriented. I stuck to my story through multiple debriefings, adding small details each time to make it more convincing. The fall that destroyed my equipment, the creek I'd followed in the wrong direction, the fever I'd developed in the second week that clouded my judgment. I became good at lying, too good. After 3 weeks, they cleared me to return to work, though with a recommendation for desk duty until I completed a psychological evaluation. The therapist they assigned was kind, professional, genuinely concerned about my mental state after the trauma. I told her about the isolation, the fear, the desperate struggle to survive. All true, just carefully edited. She diagnosed me with mild PTSD and prescribed medication I never took. How could pills help with what I was actually experiencing? The memories that kept me awake at night weren't about survival fear. They were about Luna's patient teaching, Gray Shoulder's protective presence, the elders' grateful eyes. I wasn't traumatized by what happened. I was grieving the loss of it. 3 months after my return, I quit my job, told them I needed a career change, that the incident had made me reevaluate my priorities. They understood, wrote me excellent references, wished me well. I moved to a small town in Oregon and took a position with an environmental nonprofit doing office work. Safe, boring, far from the Ozarks. But I couldn't stop thinking about them. I monitored news from southern Missouri obsessively, searching for any indication they'd been discovered. Every article about wildlife sightings, every report of unusual activity in the national forest made my heart race. But there was nothing. No leaked drone footage, no sensational discoveries, no evidence that anyone else knew what existed in those mountains. They'd successfully disappeared. Again. A year passed, then another. The braided cord Luna had given me stayed hidden under my shirt, a constant reminder against my skin. I'd taken a small scar on my forearm from a cooking accident in the settlement, the only physical evidence besides the cord that any of it had happened. Sometimes I'd trace the scar with my finger and wonder if the elder's burn had healed cleanly, if my treatment had been enough. On the second anniversary of my return, I made a decision. I had to go back. Not to find them. I knew that was impossible and wrong. But I needed to see the basin one more time, needed to confirm it had all been real and not some elaborate hallucination born from isolation and fever. I planned the trip carefully, waiting until late fall when tourist activity was minimal. I told no one where I was going. I packed light, just basic camping gear, no research equipment, nothing that would suggest official business. This was personal. The drive to Missouri took 2 days. I parked at the same trailhead where I'd started my original research trip, now almost exactly 2 years ago. The forest looked the same, but felt different, like returning to a childhood home and finding all the proportions wrong. I hiked for 6 hours before reaching the ridgeline where I'd first seen Gray Shoulder's silhouette in the fog. My compass worked normally now. My GPS held signal. Whatever phenomenon had disrupted them before was gone, or perhaps had never existed outside that specific location. I found the passage between the limestone formations, now nearly overgrown with fresh vine growth. I had to cut my way through, and I hesitated before entering, remembering the last time I'd walked this path. How different I'd been then, how much I hadn't understood. The narrow corridor was darker than I remembered, damper, but it led where I expected, opening into the hidden basin. I stepped through and felt my breath catch. The settlement was gone, completely gone.
The basin looked like it had never been touched by anything other than natural forces. Where the dome structures had stood, there was only undisturbed forest floor, covered in years' worth of fallen leaves. The stream still ran through the center, but the banks showed no sign of the water collection systems, no remnants of the clay pots. The areas where fire pits had been were completely overgrown with new vegetation.
I walked the entire perimeter, searching desperately for any trace of what I'd witnessed. The work areas, the drying racks, the tool storage, all of it gone. Not just abandoned, but erased. They'd returned after evacuating and removed every single piece of evidence. Or maybe nature had reclaimed it faster than seemed possible. I knew which explanation was more likely. At the far end, where the crystal formations jutted from the cliff face, I stopped and placed my hand against the stone. This was where I'd watched them communicate with distant groups using reflected moonlight, where Luna had trusted me with their secret. The crystals were still there, but they looked different now. Just ordinary mineral deposits catching afternoon light. Had any of it been real? Or had isolation and stress created an elaborate delusion that felt more vivid than reality? Then I touched the braided cord under my shirt and felt the textured knots Luna's fingers had tied. I looked at the scar on my forearm from that cooking fire. Physical proof. Tangible evidence that couldn't be explained away. I sat down on a flat rock and let myself cry for the first time since returning to civilization. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming weight of carrying this secret alone. Of knowing something extraordinary and being unable to share it with anyone. Of having experienced a connection with another intelligent species and having no way to prove it happened. That's why I'm telling you this now. I know most of you watching won't believe me. I know it sounds impossible, like a fantasy or a delusion. But I need someone to know. I need this story to exist somewhere outside my own head. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to everything I've shared, I'm asking you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. Not for me, but because stories like this, stories about the unknown, about what might still be hidden in the last wild places, deserve to be heard. Leave a comment telling me whether you believe me or not. I can handle skepticism. What I can't handle anymore is the silence. Because here's what keeps me up at night. They're still out there. Somewhere in the vast wilderness areas of North America, small groups of intelligent beings are living in complete secrecy, managing to avoid detection even in our age of satellite imagery and thermal drones. They have language, culture, technology adapted to their needs. They communicate across distances, care for their elderly, make deliberate choices about their future. And they trusted me enough to let me live when they could have killed me. They shared their world with me when they could have kept me in ignorance. Gray Shoulder made a choice to believe I would keep their secret, even knowing the risk I represented. I've honored that trust for over 4 years now. I haven't led anyone back to that basin. I haven't shared the exact coordinates or the specific landmarks. If you went looking based on what I've described, you'd never find it. The Ozarks cover thousands of square miles of rough terrain. But the truth is eating me alive from the inside. So this is my compromise, sharing the story without revealing enough to endanger them. Letting people know that we're not alone, that intelligence took a different evolutionary path and survived in the shadows while we built our cities and technology. The braided cord is still around my neck as I record this. I've never taken it off. Sometimes I wonder if Luna is still alive, if she ever thinks about the strange, hairless creature who stumbled into their world and had to leave it behind. I wonder if the elder's arm healed properly, if my improvised treatment was enough. I wonder if they found a new home, deeper in the wilderness, safer from drone surveys and human expansion. Mostly I wonder what I really gave up when I chose to return to civilization. Would I have survived long-term living as they did? Would I have truly adapted, or would I have become a burden, a weakness in their carefully balanced survival? I'll never know. What I do know is this: we share this planet with something remarkable, something that deserves to remain hidden and protected. My life's purpose now is making sure that happens, even if it means carrying this secret until I die. So that's my story. That's what happened during those 5 months I was listed as missing in the Ozark Mountains. That's why I quit my career, moved across the country, and live a quiet life far from the wilderness I once loved. And that's why I'm here, in the middle of the night, finally breaking my silence. Not for vindication or proof or fame, but because some truths are too heavy to carry alone forever. If you believe me, thank you. If you don't, I understand. Either way, I've done what I needed to do. The secret is out, but they remain safe, and that's all that matters.